Movie sequels are usually bad. It doesn't matter what metric you want to use, Rotten Tomatoes scores, audience popularity, industry awards, across the board throughout the history of film, sequels have almost always fallen short of the original. Yes, you may be able to name some great sequels off the top of your head, but for each one of those memorable few that managed to live up to the original, there are dozens and dozens of forgotten failures. And while most people understand that there is a general trend of sequels being extremely hit or miss, with a strong skew towards miss, what most people don't understand is why this is the case, and particularly why this is a trend that is far more common in film than other mediums. Now, a lot of the typical reasons that are thrown out are, maybe the writer had more time to work on the original than the sequel, sometimes a different director is brought on board, often the studio wants to just copy the original but with a bigger budget. On and on, you can keep listing logistical factors, but even if you magically resolved all of these issues, it wouldn't really matter. Because at the core of it, there is one single inherent problem with making sequels. One of the basic principles of screenwriting that makes it so that the concept of a sequel should almost never make sense in the first place. The through line. What is the through line? Well, if you're writing a novel, or in this case, a screenplay, the through line is what many refer to as the quote-unquote spine of the narrative. The through line is held up as the most important cornerstone of writing a screenplay. Some refer to it as the main character's journey, others refer to it as the development of the thematic argument from start to finish, but the consensus is that the through line is essentially the story that is being told from beginning to end. A lot of events can occur throughout the film, but that is separate from the through line that ties everything together. For example, underneath all the musical numbers and misadventures, the through line of The Lion King is Simba's coming-of-age story. Starting as a naive, reckless wannabe king and growing into a mature, wizened leader who is actually fit to rule. This through line stretches from start to finish, and everything else is held together by it. By following Simba's journey, we learn the importance of facing your past mistakes, not running from one's problems, and to forgive oneself, all of it wrapped in this notion of the circle of life. So by the end of The Lion King, Simba's story is complete. His character need has been met, he has grown in all the ways his character was designed to grow, and by taking us through his arc, all of the film's messages have been fully developed and communicated to the viewer. Meaning that by the end of The Lion King, the entire point of the story of Simba has been made. Which means that guess what? A sequel doesn't make any sense. The purpose of Simba's character, why he was designed, was for this specific conflict, to give us this specific character arc that teaches us a specific lesson. Just saying, well, now do some more with this doesn't work because the through line is already complete. So when a sequel is ordered, what is actually being demanded is not a continuation of Simba's story, because the story the character was designed to tell has already been told, but rather to make up some other random story and somehow force in an already complete character and reuse the same setting, so that the studio can make cash off a name brand. Which means that now you are actually having to crudely attach a new through line to a perfectly complete through line and pretend that this organically makes sense, usually by bending over backwards to force in some new character need that the character was clearly not designed for in the first place, and trying to make this match with a new theme despite the fact that the original film didn't need more fluff tacked onto the end of its already complete message. So now Simba's a bad dad and a jerk just because it has to be that way. He may as well not even be the same character as the first film, as now he's just being written however he needs to be written to give the new story something to work with. And let me give you a quick example so you can understand why this is a problem that affects the film industry in particular. Studios usually don't know whether they want a sequel or not till they see how the first film does. So most screenwriters will at best be leaving things vaguely open to a sequel rather than definitely setting up a longer through line that will stretch over multiple films. The Marvel Universe is one of the few franchises successful enough that it knows for a fact that its characters will be getting sequels from the start, and even they have only recently started clearly thinking about what a longer through line over multiple films will look like for their characters. So compare this to, say, fantasy book writers, who are not operating with big budgets, who can freely plan a coherent multi-book narrative from the start. That's why the Lord of the Rings film trilogy works so well, because it's adapting a book trilogy that already tells one continuous story from start to finish. It's not as though the Fellowship of the Rings was written, and then later on Tolkien decided to write The Two Towers and The Return of the King. No, it's all one narrative. So looking at the film trilogy, even though The Two Towers and The Return of the King are technically sequels to The Fellowship of the Ring, really it's all just one overarching through line that is simply broken up into distinct parts, which makes it flow infinitely better than most other film trilogies. In The Lord of the Rings, we can just observe Frodo and Sam's journey and see that within each individual movie, yes, we have a clear arc to their story, a clear point of resolution and message from their dynamic within each individual movie, but at the same time in the overarching narrative across the entire trilogy, we can see the logical progression from movie 1 to 2 to 3, that this is all part of one continuous journey for their character dynamic that only truly hits its fitting resolution at the end of the third movie. Or you could look at Aragorn, the story of the Lone Ranger who grew to take his rightful spot as king, and you can see there is a self-contained arc for him in each individual film, while all still naturally building towards this final resolution of his long-running through line where he does finally become king. Literally just look at the title of the third film to see how he has been playing out one continuous through line across all three films with one inevitable final destination. But that doesn't mean good sequels are limited to film series adapted from books. It's the intent of a longer through line from the start that matters. You could even just look at the original Star Wars trilogy, where sure, Lucas didn't have the entire 3-movie story meticulously planned out from the beginning, but it was still clear that the first film was just the start for Luke Skywalker's journey. And while he had some strong development in that first segment, his entire journey to becoming a Jedi Master, bringing balance to the Force, and overthrowing the Empire was a 3-step process. The longer through line made sense. Even if the final film isn't considered as good as the first two, it's not because the story is forced. It was more so various minor reasons that piled up, but from a screenwriting perspective, this film was obviously needed as a resolution to the story of Star Wars, because from the start, Luke always needed to become this man. So ideally, when you have film franchises with multiple films, the progression should look like this, where each film provides one strong step towards the completion of the through line, so that each film justifies being its own segment of the story, but at the same time it's all in the process of completing that one overarching through line. Instead of how most movie sequels are, where you have a complete arc, and then studios just want sequels, so they just tack on another arc that usually has no justification for even existing, because the point of the story of those characters should have been fulfilled in the original arc, if you did that story right. That's the paradox of sequels. If a movie is good, then a studio naturally wants a sequel. But if the movie was good, then a sequel shouldn't make any sense, since the writer should have resolved everything in the story that needed to be resolved. Now, you might be saying, well then Morge, how do you explain all the movie sequels that people loved that aren't like The Lord of the Rings and the Star Wars trilogy? After all, aren't there plenty of movie sequels that aren't inherently following the same through line as the original, but still end up being good? You're right, but there are usually some very specific reasons for that which people don't realize. So let's look at some exceptions to the norm. So first of all, if the main draw of the film and its sequel is not the story, this is where action and horror movies thrive. If the main draw is more so a visceral, adrenaline-based viewing experience, then you can pump out sequel after sequel without regard for some overarching through line, because the characters and themes are going to be secondary. We even saw the Alien franchise freely swap between genres for its sequels. The original Alien was a claustrophobic horror film, but the sequel, Aliens, just went all out into a more large-scale action film, and both are considered classics. And on that note, Reinvention can work when the original movie wasn't really good in the first place. For example, Thor 1 and 2. Now, Marvel movies do care more about the story and characters than more pure action films. So the Thor films couldn't succeed just because they have high-budget action sequences. However, Thor was not a popular character from the start, and his through line was already complete in the first film, so his second film had nothing to add, which meant with the third film, the solution was just to completely redo the character. It doesn't really matter that the Thor trilogy doesn't follow a long-running through line, because the third film practically scraps the other two and invents a completely new character. It's only technically a sequel, because really this could also easily work as our introduction to Thor. I've harped on the point that if the original film is written properly, then a sequel shouldn't make sense because the through line would already be complete. But that's not to say that a good writer can't figure out some way to force a new through line that does actually fit in seamlessly enough with the first film that it at least gives the illusion that it all flows together. For example, Superman 2 was a planned sequel, where Superman deals with the difficulties of being a hero, decides he no longer wants to be a hero, but ultimately accepts that responsibility. Now, Spider-Man 2 was an unplanned sequel, but it simply uses the same story template as Superman 2, and turned out to be a really good sequel. Same template with The Dark Knight, which was not originally a completely planned out sequel. That's because focusing on a character's path to becoming a hero in the first film, and then on overcoming the struggles of actually being a hero in the next film, naturally feels like a complete character journey, regardless of whether or not that sequel was completely planned. The illusion of a continuous throughline is maintained. The Godfather Part 2 is considered one of the greatest films of all time, and likely the only sequel that gets away with not really completing the throughline of the original and also not falling under any of the exception categories that I previously mentioned. In the original Godfather, Michael Corleone is a young, optimistic man, college-educated, a decorated soldier, the one clean member of the Corleone crime family, who is then gradually sucked into the mafia life, becoming embroiled in revenge and murder, and ultimately rising to become the ruthless new mafia boss of the Corleone family.
I never wanted this for you.
This transformation is the story of Michael Corleone, the rise to becoming a Don, but more so his fall into the same cycle of crime his father wanted to free him from. The second film simply shows more of that fall, Michael becoming more cold, more heartless, more estranged from his loved ones, but Michael's core character transformation from white to black was complete in the first film. You don't really need a second film simply to show that black getting darker. A lot of Part 2 is essentially filling in what the first film already implied, that Michael would kill even his own brother for going against the family, that Michael was no longer the man his wife loved. But who Michael had become, and the crucial moral threshold he had crossed, had already been established in Part 1, making his continuing moral shift in the same direction in Part 2 feel minute in comparison. But here's why it still works. Even setting aside the brilliant direction, dialogue, and performances of Part 2, just looking at the story, as an arguably unneeded continuation of the story of Michael, The Godfather Part 2 still succeeds as the rare sequel that actually enhances the first by going back over the same ideas and story. The original Godfather could be described as the tragedy of Michael Corleone, but the second heightens that sense of tragedy by setting the narrative to the backdrop of Vito Corleone's story, Michael's father. Seeing Michael's continued descent gains new weight when contrasted with Vito's rise, taking subtler sentiments from the first film to vivid new heights, showing us what has been lost between these two generations, a sense of justice and honor, but also the hope for a better future, with Michael now walking a path darker than Vito's ever was. And so The Godfather Part 2 is an exception to the law of sequels in a way that is difficult to describe. It was not needed to complete the story. Mario Puzo even acknowledged that the double structure was the only way to justify the sequel, but the film is able to take this idea of the contrast between generations, a sense of what once was and what could have been, and with the two parallel narratives is able to dig into these feelings in a way that the first could not. So all of that is to say that yes, sequels can still be good, but usually there has to be a very specific reason that a sequel is able to break from the norm, with the norm being that a sequel pretty much never makes sense in the first place. Because as long as movies are made without the starting intent of a continuing through line over multiple films, sequels will probably continue to be terrible, tacked on cash grabs, with the odd exception here or there. So if you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe for more videos like this every week.